Hi, I'm Julie Woodward, Acting Director of Forestry with the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. It is my pleasure to be your host for today's webinar on the 2020 Labor Day fires, economic impact to Oregon's forest sector. This webinar is sponsored by the Oregon Forest Resources Institute and their board of directors. We want to give recognition and a thank you to all of our presenters today who have given their time and sharing their expertise. We have a full agenda from now until 4:30. If you don't have the agenda, it's still available to download in the link provided in chat. I know this is a little bit harder to read, but there is one available to download if you haven't had a chance to get the agenda. We have several panels today, and we are looking forward to all the information they're going to present. We want to thank all of you too for joining us today. Many of you have probably joined a Zoom webinar, but let me give you a few details to help you navigate this webinar. Probably your Zoom toolbar should be located at either the top or bottom of your screen. If you don't see it, you can usually scroll your cursor over this area and it should pop up. Your audio and video is turned off for all participants. You will just be able to see the panelists and the presenters. We ask that you ask questions through the written questions through the Q&A box. We will be monitoring this throughout the webinar. We're asking that all of your questions be written, and we are not going to be able to take any spoken questions today. You also might notice that chat is limited, but you can send a message to the host if needed for any other issues than questions. This webinar is being recorded, and all presenters have been provided a consent clause, and attendees, you are being notified that the webinar is being recorded for future educational purposes. The views and opinions expressed by our speakers are theirs and theirs alone, and not those of the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. In 2020, the Labor Day windstorm resulted in 5 mega fires, as well as over a dozen other fires. In a matter of days, more than 1 million acres burned. While this was not the largest fire in Oregon's history, the Labor Day 2020 fires burned more acres in the Cascades Mountain Range than any other year and set records for fire acreage on lands protected by the Oregon Department of Forestry. While the fires destroyed thousands of structures, caused deaths and fatalities, and billions of dollars in damage, nearly half the acreage burned was on privately owned forests, which sustainably provides the bulk of Oregon's timber harvest for local mills. OFRE sent out an RFP and commissioned a report to capture the short-term and long-term economic impact to Oregon's forest sector. This full-page, 100-plus page report was prepared by the Mason, Bruce, and Girard, MBG, and the Forest Economic Advisors. Since 1921, MBG has provided natural resource consulting services to the private and public sectors. They have a multidisciplinary firm which specializes in forestry, environmental, and geospatial consulting, including numerous years of leading economic studies and assessments. The Forest Economic Advisors is a leading provider of forest sector economic analysis and forecasting in the US, backed by FEA's proprietary economic models. The OFRE staff prepared a summary report of key findings and put together this webinar to help bring the reports and information to the public. These reports are available for free download or to order. In addition, we put together fact sheets on those 5 mega fires. It's my pleasure to introduce my co-host for today and OFRE's newest interim executive director, Mike Clausey. Probably not a stranger to many of you, but we're excited to have Mike back as part of our team. And Mike was an integral part of when we started this project. So I'd like to give Mike an opportunity to say a few words about the project, and we'll introduce our first panel.
Thanks, Julie. Sorry about this. It says my video is showing, but I don't see myself. So we'll do without my video. You guys don't need to see me.
We can see you.
Oh, good. I can't see myself. That's probably better. I probably have the view on speaker rather than on gallery or something like that. Anyway, I'm really excited about this webinar, excited about the project. I was sitting in a conference room at Seneca Sawmill down in Eugene on September 9th. And it was getting very smoky, and everybody's cell phone kept going off about evacuations and everything else that was happening with the Holiday Farm fire, the Archie Creek fire. And as I drove back to Mount Angel that afternoon, I could just see the smoke cloud from the Beachy Creek in the Riverside. And it occurred to me that this was a cataclysmic event. And we, OFRI, needed to do the analysis, needed to hire someone smart to do the analysis, to do the communication about what was happening to our sector. And I'm really happy to thank the OFRI board for approving the funding for this project. I'm really thankful to the members of the project advisory committee who helped us develop the RFP, who helped us select the contractor and reviewed the report details. Also, I want to thank all the landowners, foresters, operators, and others who contributed to the study. And most of all, thank the project team that you're going to hear from in a little bit. Incredible report that they've done. And I'm really pleased that we've got it. And finally, I want to thank the OFRI staff because they've done a fantastic job in putting together a web page, our summary report, our megafire fact sheets, and this webinar. And a big thanks to Julie, because in the middle, as we were finishing up this project, we thought we were almost done with it. I retired and left Julie holding the bag. But as you all know, Julie, she holds bags really well and has carried it to fruition. So without any other words from me, I want to introduce our first panel. And this is made up of our project team and some support. So you're going to hear from Mark Rasmussen of Mason, Bruce, and Girard, who was like the lead on the study. He did a lot of the heavy lifting and the guiding on their end. Also going to hear in the discussion at the end, the Q&A from Roger Lord, who is economist and principal and the president of MBG. You're going to hear from Rocky Goodnow, vice president from FEA. Really sharp guy, knows his stuff. And finally, you're going to hear from Gail Krumenauer, who is the state employment economist with the Oregon Employment Department. And we couldn't do this without all four of these folks. And I'm going to turn it over to Mark. Take it away, bud.
Thanks, Mike. I'll share my screen here. This is, I'm Mark Rasmussen. I'm the senior partner at Mason, Bruce, and Girard. And I'm really glad that we were asked to be here. We're happy to do this study. We learned a lot, and we hope that the other people who look at the study and use the study can find what they're looking for in this study. Now, this is my first time talking into the void like this, so I hope you'll be patient with me. I'll be talking first here, and then we'll be hearing from Rocky. And I'm trying to figure out how to advance my slide now. Sorry. Yeah, okay. Here we go. Okay, so our report, as stated before, our report is found on OFRI's website, and I hope you go and download that. We're really just going to touch on some highlights today. We're going to talk about the high-level view of the fires, acres and volumes, and the economic impact on the sector. Then I'll hand it over to Rocky Goodnow from Forest Economic Advisors to talk about the long-term timber supply impacts. There's a lot more in our study, and many of the other panelists that you see today will be touching on topics that we touched on in our study. Before we get into that, I just want to recognize and comment that we recognize that these fires had huge impacts on people and families and businesses and the firefighters and people who have property up there, and there are other studies and avenues where some of those impacts are being discussed, and while we're not trying to quantify all of that, we recognize that it was an impact much larger than what we're talking about here. Our charge was to talk about the economic impacts on the forest sector of these fires, and So that's what we're focusing on. And there's a little bit of terminology that I think would be helpful to go over that you'll see. We talk about burn severity in this study, and that's measured in terms of percent canopy loss. And we made these three categories here that are sometimes, they're different from other categories you might see. But if less than 25% of the canopy was lost, we call that low. If more than 75% was lost, we call that high, and everything else is in the middle. We call it medium. And we're going to be focusing on the volume and the value of the timber on the acres that burned with medium or high severity. Now that's sort of a cumbersome way to talk. And I might say the timber that was burned. And what I really mean is the volume or the value of the timber on acres burned with medium or high severity. That's primarily the focus of our work here. And we're going to talk about the economic impacts to Oregon's forest sector based on the value of the end products produced by those by all the folks in the forest sector. And I'll show you more about that later. How is this study unique? Well, if you were to search the internet, you could find other studies that look at the impacts, some of the economic impacts of the fires and the cost of the fires. Ours, I think, is the first study that looks at all the impacts across the entire forest sector, not just the stumpage value. And we're also looking across all the different landowner types, the federal land managers and the private landowners, and we built an accounting system to put all of that on a common basis, even though those owners have different objectives. And I think that our study is one of the few that recognized the value of the timber that was recovered or is being recovered through salvage. Now, as Mike said, we've looked at 12 fires here. 5 of them are classed as megafires. They're more than 100,000 acres, and they all ignited on Labor Day a year ago. 4 of them are large in the 10 to 45,000 acre size, and we include them because they have an important economic impact on the forest sector. And then there are 3 smaller fires that started a few days prior or a little bit prior to Labor Day that are important on the east side. And so we're looking at these 12 fires. There were some others, but we're looking at these 12 fires, total of 971,000 acres. And as Julie was saying, what's interesting and different about the fires in 2020 is that much of the acres burned were on the on the west side of the Cascades. Here you see the east side acres burned in yellow and the west side in green. And we understand that this is the largest fire season in the western Cascades, northwestern Cascades for 120 years. And as Julie said, this was for ODF on the acres that they protect. This was their largest fire season ever. Now here we're looking at the fires, total acres in the fires, and we've broken the acres into, again, these high, medium, low, based on the canopy covered scheme that I talked about earlier. And so what you can see is that 45% of the acres burned in these fires was high severity. I haven't been able to do the work to figure out if that's unusual. With the fires that I've been involved with, that is unusual. These fires burned hotter than typical. And you see 25% is unburned. 25% of the acres within the fire perimeters are unburned, classified as unburned. And that leaves about 30% that were burned with low and medium severity, about equally split between the two. When we look at the acres burned by ownership, The highest category was the Forest Service, but these fires were unusual in that they burned a large amount of private land. 46% of the acres in these 12 fires were on private land. We've split the private land into two groups. Large private, these are the corporate forests owned by timber companies and institutional investors and so forth. And then other private, which is the acres owned by the small family forest owners, managers. And we also included, for the purpose of disclosure, we included the tribal forest lands with the family forest lands, and we call that the other private. Okay. Now to understand the future impacts of the fires, we wanted to understand which acres burned up, how old was the timber on the acres that burned, so that we could understand when that timber would have been coming onto the market. And so we classified, using an image classifier, we classified the pre-fire acres as being in these three classes: recent harvest, 0 to 8 years old; the pre-merge acres were 9 to 34 years old, and the merge acres were 35 plus years old. Now, there are some landowners, especially the public landowners, that would not cut down to 35, but certainly on the private lands, in terms of the fire salvage, acres down to 35 years old were being salvaged. So we drew that line at 35 to be consistent with that activity. You can see here that a lot of the Forest Service timber that burned was in this merchantable category. On the large private, it's maybe more or less equally split between the three, maybe not quite equally. And on the other private, it's got a little more merchantable, a little less pre-merge. I caution you to draw any conclusions about fire behavior based on age from this graph. I think this is mostly reflecting really what was out there. And we know that the large private landowners have shorter rotations, so they have fewer acres that are in this merchantable class. The Forest Service and the BLM are managing on the acres that are managed for timber harvest, have much longer rotations, so they end up with a lot more acres in these classes, these older classes. In our report, you'll see we do a lot of reporting by market area. I won't go over that very much, but we split the fires in the burned area into these 4 market areas, and you can go into the report and get a lot of insight about that. How did we do this? Well, we did a lot of work with the images, the burn severity and the ownership and ages and that kind of information came from image processing. We took the publicly available inventory data from the Forest Service and pushed that out onto the burned acres, and then we made summaries by average volumes by ownership and fire. We tried to account for deterioration and defect and so forth. And then you'll see we're making estimates of the acres and volumes that would be salvaged. And that information came primarily from interviews with land managers and landowners, and our observation and our experience as we're out doing some of the salvage on the properties that we manage. Here's an example. I hope this shows up okay, and you can see this is an image that shows some acres that were within the fire perimeter, and when that's processed into fire severity, you see some acres are red, meaning high severity, some acres are yellow, which means medium, and some acres are less orange, which means low, and the green areas are unburned. So even within an area that had a lot of severe a lot of high severity fire, on the landscape. There's lots of acres that were not burned. As we saw, 25% of the acres are classified as unburned. Now, to come to a conclusion about the economic impacts, we had to think about how to classify the acres for analysis. And in this table here, I want to spend just a minute to introduce you to how we thought about this. And we're looking here at just the column for the Forest Service as an example. So on Forest Service lands, there were 364,000 acres that were within the fire perimeter. Of those, we estimate about 17,000 acres were roads and non-forest. And that left us with 347,000 acres of forested. So you see, these two, row number 2 and row number 3, add up to be row number 1. If we look at the forested acres, we split that into 2 buckets. The unburned and low severity, 132,000 acres, and the medium and high severity, 215,000 acres. Okay, so row 4 and 5 add up to row 3. If I take row 5 now, I'm interested in understanding the age class distribution between the medium, for the high and medium severity forested acres. The forested acres burned with high and medium severity fire. 53,000 of those acres were pre-merchantable, and 161,000 acres of those are merchantable. If I look at these merchantable acres, now I'm interested in understanding how many of those acres are available for sustainable harvest. On the Forest Service, that's about 53,000 acres that are available for sustainable harvest under the forest management plans, and about 109,000 acres are unavailable due to the land allocation in the Northwest Forest Plan. So you see, we call this a waterfall table, where we're sort of narrowing down to eventually how many acres could be available for, how many acres were burned with medium and high severity, have merchantable timber, and are on acres that could be available for sustained harvest. Then, through our interviews and surveys and so forth, we are estimating the acres that will likely be salvaged. So of those 52,000, well, I got to be careful here. On the Forest Service, we estimate that about 18,000 acres of the acres within the fire perimeter will be salvaged. And some of that comes from these acres, and some of it might come from these acres, the acres that are unavailable within the forest plan for sustainable harvest. In the case of the Forest Service, for example, the Northwest Forest Plan makes available for salvage harvest acres that are burned within the LSRs, late successional reserves, for example. Okay, so here's the summary of the acres. We have 970,000 acres within the fire perimeters. About 594,000 of those acres are forested acres that were burned with medium and high severity. About 313,000 of those acres had merchantable timber on it. About 281,000 acres had pre-merchantable timber. Of this merchantable timber, 157,000 are on acres that are available for sustainable harvest, and about an equal number are on acres that are not available for sustained harvest. And we think that about 106,000 acres are likely to be have salvage harvest on them. Now, if you start looking between the landowners, you'll see proportions that are quite, the proportions between these categories differ. We believe, for example, that almost all of the acres available for sustainable harvest that were burned on the large private landowners will be harvest at 38,000 out of 44,000. And similarly on the other private category, a large percentage will be or have been harvested. In contrast, on the Forest Service, it looks like to us about 18,000 of the 52,000 acres here and the 108,000 acres here would be salvage harvest. The BLM has a higher proportion and ODF has a higher proportion. That's acres. We next went to the inventory data to put volumes on these acres. So on that 971,000 acre, there's almost 15 billion board feet. This is in 1,000 board feet. So this is 15 billion board feet of timber that's within the fire perimeters. On the medium and high severity lands, that was about 9 billion board feet of timber. And all of that, of course, is merchantable. On the acres available for sustainable harvest, about 3.9 billion board feet burned. And we think that about 1.3 billion board feet will be recovered through salvage. Now, to put that in perspective, we can compare that to Oregon's average timber harvest. In Oregon, across the state, we harvest on average about 3.8 billion board feet a year. So this 15 billion board feet is about almost 4 years worth of average harvest. This 9 billion board feet that burned with medium and high severity, that's about 2.5 years worth of harvest. And this salvage represents about a little bit less than half a year's worth of worth of average harvest. Now, our charge, as I said earlier, was to understand and estimate the value, the economic impact on Oregon's forest sector. So what is Oregon's forest sector? Well, it's a broad set of people and companies and enterprises that are engaged in managing timberland. So you have landowners and foresters and the reforestation contractors and the road contractors and so on. People who harvest timber, so there's foresters and regulators and loggers and haulers and road contractors, scalers and so forth. And then the people who take those logs and manufacture that into some kind of a finished wood product. So we have sawmills and veneer mills and pulp and paper and poles and exporters and even some biomass energy in this state. So that's the forest sector. And we make an estimate of the value of that timber based on the observation that in the last mill study conducted for Oregon, we found that the average value, on average, the value of the timber processed into final products had a value of $1,929 per 1,000 board feet of harvest. Okay, so that's the value of the final wood products, and that value has to pay all those folks and cover the cost of all that activity prior to selling those products. So that's the loggers and the landowners and the scalers and the truckers and the foresters and everyone else, and all the mill workers and all the suppliers, everyone else in the chain before the final product. All that adds up to almost $2,000 a 1,000 board feet. So within the fire perimeters, I'll just touch again, that it was about $30 billion. The timber that burned up, if processed through the Oregon's forest sector, would have created $30 billion worth of value. On the acres burned on medium and high severity, that's about $18 billion. The merchantable timber was about, well, close to $18 billion. And about $2.6 billion is the value of the timber that's being salvaged. We put a note in here. Often we talk about the stumpage value, which is what the price people pay for the timber standing on the stump. So of this $17 billion, about 3.4 billion of that is the stumpage value. So we put all this together. Let me back up here. For our economic impact analysis here, we're starting with what I believe is the most conservative estimate of impact that we could come up with. We're starting with this number, $7.5 billion. This is the value of the merchantable timber that was burned with medium and high severity on acres that are available for sustainable timber harvest. Okay. Now, other folks might want to go up this chain a little further and say, no, this is what was really lost to Oregon's forest sector. In this study, we took the most conservative view of this and said, we're going to start here with this bottom line. This is what was lost. And so you see that number right here. That's the top number. We calculated the present net value of the pre-merged timber on those acres burned with high and medium severity. That's about $704 million. You'll see in the study we estimate the additional road reconstruction and maintenance costs because of the fire. Rex Storm here will talk soon about the losses directly to forest contractors. That's about $100 million. There'll be about $144 million worth of reforestation that will be spent on this fire. So we come up with a total, after adding all that up, of about $8.5 billion worth of impacts. Offset is the $2.6 billion of the timber that we think will be salvaged, leaving a net economic impact of $5.9 billion. Okay, I'm going to now turn the mic over to Rocky Goodnow from Forest Economic Advisors. I'll just, I hope you all know about FEA. They produce just great information about the wood products industry to anyone who wants to subscribe to those services. We've worked several projects with Rocky in the past and have always found his work top notch and always enjoy working with him. So Rocky, I'll continue to work the slides here.
All right.
But you don't get to work the pointer, I guess, if that's the case. So you let me know if you want me to move that pointer somewhere.
Okay, I'll try to direct you. Thanks, Mark. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks for everyone for attending today and giving me the opportunity just to discuss some more of the findings of the study that we did with MB&G. And the portion I really want to concentrate on is, Mark did a great job kind of covering the impacts of the fire, the immediate impacts to the industry, and putting a dollar value on that. What I really want to discuss is, what we see as the future impact of the Labor Day wildfires on the forest resource and the overall forest products industry. And so just a quick summary, and this really builds off of some of Mark's discussion on how we approach this is, first we looked at all of the ownership information, the damage, and we classified that into 5-year age classes. And we did that by different methodologies depending on the availability and the quality of data, using both the Forest Service's FIA data and then LEMA and GNN data. And that was really a critical part of the project that the guys at MB&G put together to really give us this ability to look at the distribution of the damage. And similar to Mark's caveat, when I'm saying damage, I am referring to that medium and high severity damage, the fire that we do consider to be the portion of the acres we do consider to be lost due to the fire. And so we took that age class distribution and then we projected that going forward to really try to quantify what that volume was that, if not for the fires, would have matured into merchantable age classes and would have been available for harvest. And so everything, all the volumes I'm going to speak about is really looking at that lost potential harvest. And when we were considering that and projecting that into the future, we did make some adjustments, assuming some higher yields on the private stands that we would have realized in the future, just to account for greater yields expected from more intensive management and improved seed genetics. And when we looked at this, we looked at this in 5-year age classes. And when we consider the first 5-year age class, we were really only looking at that lost potential growth from the younger stands that would have that portion of volume that would have been accumulated over the next 5 years if those the almost merchantable stands would have been allowed to continue growing. And so you'll see once we look at the impacts over a 40-year rotation that the initial impacts and future losses are pretty minor, but then they accumulate over that 40-year rotation. And so next slide, this was really critical. Thanks, Mark.
I'm sorry.
It's all right.
There we go.
Okay, nice. So, and when we really think about the future impacts, one of the things when we first started looking at this that really stood out to us was especially on the privately owned resource, because a bulk of the damage occurred on younger pre-merchantable or recently harvested stands, then it was pretty clear that the impact of this was going to persist. It wasn't going to be only what was burned out there, that the impact to the forest resource and to the industry was going to play out over a number of years. And so this is just taking a look, separated by that large private timberland owner and the other private, and just making the point that if you consider those age classes below 35 years as pre-merchantable or recently harvested, that made up the bulk, well over 2/3 of the total acres damaged. And so that's what really led us to take to do this portion of the analysis. And another important factor when we are discussing this is just to note that this is completely focused on the private forest land resource. And we focused on that for really the primary reason is we wanted to try to quantify what the lost potential harvest is. And so when we consider lost potential on public lands, next slide, we really didn't see the wildfires impacting the ability of the public agencies to continue their planned harvest. And so just a couple of points here, when we look at the Forest Service harvest on the Forest Service managed lands, we know that the average harvest levels are below the volumes as prescribed on the Northwest Forest Plan. And we want to be clear that we fully expect and have seen that the wildfires have disrupted timber sales planned for the next few years. And that is, going to be a factor. But when we consider the loss of the volume on the Forest Service lands and their ability to continue harvesting at their recent historical levels, we think that still exists. And anecdotally have heard that they continue to plan to harvest, what they're at near their historical levels. And similarly on the BLM, we know that average harvest on those lands are closer to their allowable sale quantity, but they do not, the loss of timber on the BLM lands is not going to disrupt their ability to continue offering harvest volumes laid out in their harvest plans. And so from a potential loss harvest standpoint, that's why we decided not to consider the public lands. And moving on to the next slide, when we looked, and this is specifically looking at the market areas in Western Oregon, we can see that this, the damage and the portion of the severely damaged area in pre-merchantable was pretty consistent across Western Oregon, ranging from, and this is looking at those 3 market areas that Mark had on a map earlier in the presentation, broken out by pre-merchantable and merchantable, and really showing that, by and large, across all 3 Western markets, the overwhelming majority of the damage occurred to pre-merchantable or stands with timber less than 35 years old. And so putting that together and putting some volumes around that, next slide. This is our accounting for the annual impacts in that first set of data in the first 3 columns over a 40-year planning horizon, separated out by large private and other private. And then in the last 2 columns, we just have the cumulative for those periods. And so I think the 2 numbers or ranges of numbers to really focus on here is looking at that 3rd column. Once we're past the near term, when we consider that lost potential harvest from the wildfires, it ranges, and this is just a factor of the age class distribution we saw on the damaged acres, from a little over 100 million board feet to nearly 270 million board feet on an annual basis. And just putting some scale on that, at that peak, we're talking equivalent to 3 to 4 average, the consumption of 3 to 4 average sawmills in Western Oregon. And then when we look at that total, which is indicated over the entire planning horizon, that total loss, which is in the bottom right-hand corner there, we can see that that's over 7 billion board feet. And back again to, average harvest levels in Western Oregon, that's, just below 3.5 billion board feet total across all ownerships are harvested on average over the past 5 years. And so we're looking at an equivalent of over 2 years worth of harvest lost over this planning horizon due to that lost potential harvest from damage to pre-merchantable stands. And if we take a look at that kind of spread out and the impact that could have, if we could take a look at the next slide, this is that volume on a market, on a per market area basis. And we can see a couple things. One, market 2, which is really that central Western Oregon, the Willamette Valley, is where we expect the greatest loss potential will occur. And again, that's just a function of where the greatest damage occurred. And we also see, given the distribution, the age class distribution, market 3, which is southwestern Oregon, the damage really, the loss potential harvest really picks up towards the end of this planning horizon, past 2050. But looking at this on a share of average harvest level basis, in the next slide, we can see that it ranges from 3% in the near term, 3 to 7%, depending on the market, to a peak of 8 to a little over 14% of an average harvest loss across all of those market areas in Western Oregon. And this is particularly an issue from the forest product standpoint, forest product industry standpoint, this lost potential harvest, because this is a region that was already constrained by timber supply. And if we take a look at the next slide, and just as a way of illustrating that, this is taking a look at the total softwood lumber capacity across 3 major producing regions in North America, US West Coast. So that's going to include Western Oregon and Western Washington, the US South and British Columbia. And we're just taking 5-year snapshots of softwood lumber capacity. And where, what we can see from looking at this is timber supply has been a binding constraint for the West Coast sawmill industry. If we could just compare this to British Columbia, which has seen a significant decline in available timber, mostly related to the mountain pine beetle epidemic, we can see that relative to the previous peak in 2005, by 2020, they've lost about a third of their lumber capacity. In the coast, despite especially even more recently strong markets, we've seen capacity continue to decline, really related to the lack of available harvest and timber supply. And compared to 2005, we've seen a decline of nearly 20% in softwood lumber capacity in the West Coast. And so when we consider that we've already seen constraints on the industry from timber supply, with this further loss, it's going to continue to be a limiting factor for the industry. And just, by comparison, where we have seen stronger growth is in the US South, where currently there is a significant overhang of standing timber volume relative to their harvest. And so we're seeing more investment in capacity going to the region that has the available fiber supply. And finally, we're looking at this in terms of billion board feet in volume, but looking at the kind of socioeconomic impact to the industry and to Oregon's economy, we looked at this potential harvest shortfall in terms of lost employment. And we really relied on some previous work by OFRI, where they quantified that 1 million board feet of timber harvest equates to just below 11 full-time jobs. And so using that ratio, we can see that because of that lost potential harvest, that we're looking from over 1,200 to a peak of nearly 3,000 full-time equivalent jobs lost due to that lost potential harvest. So that is the conclusion of our remarks, but I think Mark and I would be happy to address any questions that you have. And I think there's a couple of questions here I can see on the Q&A. And
Rocky, if you'll hang on for 1 second, appreciate the presentation from you and Mark. Gail Krumenauer is also going to share a few things from the Oregon Employment Department, and then we'll jump into those questions and I'll ask those and give you and Mark an opportunity to respond to those.
Excellent, sounds great.
So just a reminder, everyone, if you have a questions, please put it in the Q&A, not in chat, and we will answer those in the order they've come in. And we may, if one of them is related to another panel, we may also reserve that right to hold it for another group, but please ask those questions through the Q&A. And Gail, welcome, and I'll let you share your screen and give a little bit about your information.
Hi, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone for asking me to join today. I just had one kind of quick point to pick up on, which is really right where Rocky left off. So I'm going to try and, with minimal disruption, share my screen just to talk a little bit more about the immediate jobs impacts that we saw during the wildfires as they were unfolding. I sat and watched kind of with the same dismay and horror that everybody else did while it happened. And one of the very small things that the employment department could do was take a look at quantifying the job impacts that were happening in real time. And so the map that you should be able to see here should be the map of Oregon. And what it is taking a look at, so from every day from about September 7th through about September 17th, our GIS analyst teamed up with me, and we took the boundaries of the fires and then paired that with the geocoded map of all the business establishments in Oregon to see what was happening. And there were 3 levels of evacuation zones. Level 1 was kind of a get ready. Number 2 was really have your stuff ready to go. And 3 was you must evacuate. And so we took a look at, this is just what you're seeing is from the height of the evacuations, which they changed over time and became more intense down in Southern Oregon. But at the peak on September 11th of 2020, we mapped it out and found that there were about 21,350 business establishments with more than 232,000 payroll jobs that were being affected in those evacuation zones in real time. And just for context, that's about the same size as Oregon's entire private healthcare industry, so many of them. And then just to kind of break it down even a little bit more, looked at which industries it was happening in and also which areas of the state. So Clackamas, Marion, Jackson, and Lincoln were among the most affected counties. And when we look at industries, clearly natural resources and mining, or what was happening in the areas where that type of work is occurring and where those types of businesses are. But also the very different dynamic in 2020 was that these fires spilled over into populated areas, into cities. So leisure and hospitality affected, construction, retail trade, and manufacturing. So just taking a look at those immediate impacts was really kind of illuminating for us to see what's happening. And even though we can, I'm gonna try and stop sharing. There we go. Even though we can kind of see those things happening in real time, it dramatically understates the displacement, the devastation of what's happening. And that's no more evident than in where Rocky was talking about just now, as we looked at kind of all of that displacement, how much actually turned into permanent job loss. And it was only about 1,500 jobs that we found that seemed to have been lost due to the destruction of those business establishments in the fires. And that is a tremendous understatement of the billions of dollars in value, and even the future outlays of maybe closer to 2,000 or 3,000 jobs that are going to be prevented from even happening because of those future impacts that we're not able to see. So just a kind of an interesting add-on, and my appreciation to Mason Girard and others that really did the heavy lifting to take a look out into the future where we can see with the data that we had available. Thank you.
Thanks, Gail. I appreciate that overview. So I'll invite Gail and Mark and Rocky to come back on screen, and we'll go through some of the questions. And again, encourage everyone to send your questions in for this particular panel. They have a lot of great data that they went through. And so if there's any questions about that, please feel free to put those in. Maybe Mark, can you remind people what kind of imagery were you using, satellite or LiDAR? And I think that came up right near the beginning of when you first started.
Yeah, we used several kinds. We did use some LiDAR data to set up a training image classifier. We used the satellite imagery. I believe it was the Sentinel data that we used. And then we also got processed imagery from the Forest Service for the fire severity.
Great. And then Russ has asked, is there assessment of the acres of government protected, like the no harvest zone lands impacted by the 2020 fires?
Yeah, you can. I think you can find that in the report.
There's a lot in there.
Yeah, there's a. I'll just tell you, when you look at the report, you should go look at the tables in the appendix. The pages and pages and pages of different ways of splitting these all these numbers up. So you can see a lot more detail than we showed you here.
And then Megan's asked if there's, she's curious as to why there might be such a difference in percentage probable salvage to harvest between the two private ownership types. Any clarification to that?
Yeah, as we were out in the woods working on the properties we managed and talking to others, we could see the forest industry mobilizing immediately to take care of the salvage, and it's really quite a success story. Maybe Rex will talk about this a little bit, but loggers came in from all over the place, and it was the larger industrial companies that were able to manage this because they had those relationships, and they mobilized quickly and were able to get the resources and move the wood out very quickly. The smaller landowners were at a disadvantage there. You know, they just didn't have the contracts and the relationships to do the work as quickly. So what you see there for the small landowners is really our estimate. There aren't yet good statistics about how that's worked out. But it was really a difference in large companies being ready and able to gather the resources quickly.
Thanks. And I think, Rocky, this came in during your talk. Do you have values of annual harvest loss per market area?
Yes. All of that is included with the study, as Mark indicated, with the public lands. A lot of that information is available in the appendices of the report. And so, yeah, we have estimates by market area for those annual losses.
Great. So this may be, thinking a little bit, you've looked a lot about the 2020 impacts, and someone's asked, with all these numbers being presented, we've seen in Oregon the increasing size and intensity of these large fires. How is the sustainability of forestry, especially private, maybe the industry, changing? Do you have any kind of take view? And that might be something we can ask the next panel as well, but just, any of your take from the information you looked at about how might people be changing their practices based on these type of large mega fires on the landscape?
Well, it raises an interesting question, and that's a little outside of the work we did for this study. I attended a meeting a month ago or so where a climatologist sort of showed that the weather pattern that we saw was that created this particular set of fires was it was an outlier in 75 years worth of data that had been collected. And his view was if the climate is warming, then we should see fewer of these kind of events going forward. So that was his opinion. Certainly, I think everyone in the forest industry today is thinking about exposure to all kinds of problems and how to adjust their management to minimize the risk on forest management.
Thanks, Mark. So I don't see any other question answer or questions. Oh, here comes another one. So this is asked, has anyone reached out to this research team or OFRI to combine the forest resource economic impacts with other environmental and social equity impacts? So I don't know if there's been a crossover into that, if anybody has ideas around kind of crossing over the economic. We really take focus on the economic in this particular instance, but I don't know, Mark or Rocky, if you guys have seen anything else also about those type of impacts.
Not yet. Our objective was to do a complete job in a short amount of time, and we were not interested in expanding the scope. just as a matter of trying to get this thing done by the deadline. Certainly, there's a lot more to be talked about here.
Julie,
Mike?
I want to jump in here. One group who has done some look at this over time is the Governor's Wildfire Response Council. In their report that was done in 2019, they pulled together a lot of this information historically. It wasn't specifically about the 2020 fires, but there is some good information out there that they've done, that they brought together. So it is doable, but it really, wasn't within OFRI's mandate and what we asked these guys to do for us. But boy, I think the Governor's Wildfire Response Council would be a great group to follow up on it.
Thanks, Mike. Well, while maybe people are typing in any last questions for this panel, thanks again for all your work on the report and the presentation today. Any last words you'd like to share with the group on this topic?
Well, yeah, there's one thing I didn't do at the beginning of my talk, which was to thank all of those people that spent some time telling us what they were doing and answering surveys and helping us understand things. We talked to lots and lots of people, and they were very generous with their time, and we really appreciate that help that was given to us.
Well, great. Well, thank you very much for all your time today and all the great information. And just a reminder to people that the reports are available, and there's both the full report and the summary report, and there's a lot of great information shared today. And if you want to go back, as Mark and Rocky mentioned, and Gail's information, and really look back onto those, this is really a good opportunity to dig into those. You can both order it and or download it. So thanks again to this panel. Really appreciate your time. That's the thing we're missing about the live session, is that we haven't gotten the audience clapping but dialed in here yet. That'll still be next on my list. So thanks again to all of you for sending in those questions. The next panel that we're going to bring forward is on forest restoration and salvage panel.